Welcome to the minor Sustainability and Economics. Welcome class of 2021-2022. You'll find yourself in the third edition of this minor, and much unlike the cartoon, the minor was started by a student initiative of the FSR and Rethinking Economics. I am Yuri Sol, the minor coordinator and lecturer in the Environmental Economics course. And today it is my honor to kick off the minor with a guest lecture in your Circular Economy course. Your course coordinator, Tim Bulters, invited me to give a lecture on the old linear economy and the much critiqued neoclassical economics school of thought. But before we dive into the content of today, a few more words about the program. The minor program consists of the following courses: Circular Economy and Degrowth, offered by the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, where degrowth is taught by Krelis Ramoth. During both courses offered by the College of Social Sciences, Citizen Change, and Green Economy and Society, you will meet a lineup of different lecturers. Citizen Change is coordinated by Iris Huis. Nikki Westerkamp coordinates Green Economy and Society. You will meet me again during Environmental Economics, offered by the College of Economics and Business. Here you see me with the monarch butterfly. A few words about me and why I am joining from a distance. I'll be joining from La Cruz de Guanacaste in Nayarit, Mexico. I'm currently in Mexico because my wife is from Mexico and Dutch immigration policy is rather unwelcoming with its integration exams. Anyway, even though summers at the Pacific coast are often a bit too hot and humid to my liking, in between Zoom calls I mostly entertain myself here with gardening. I've included some photos on the slides. As for my curriculum vitae, I like to highlight the most recent activity. 2 weeks ago, I co-organized the symposium Post-Growth Perspectives on Biodiversity Conservation. The recordings from the symposium will be made available soon on my channel and page, which you can find through Noah's Ark 2.0. As I understand, this minor offers the first classes in economics since high school for some of you, or possibly ever. For this reason, I'll start today with a brief history of economics, followed by some insights from neoclassical economics and examples of where we see these insights translated into policy. I also give some attention on problematic assumptions and shortcomings of neoclassical economics, and close with a brief overview of other schools of economic thought. So, what is economics? Probably the most used definition from Lionel Robbins reads, "Economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses." This definition highlights both human behavior and scarcity. And as we will see, disagreements with neoclassical economics also center around its conceptualization of human behavior and scarcity. The notion of scarcity strongly differs between environmental economics and ecological economics. Environmental economics can be described as the application of neoclassical economics to environmental topics. Neoclassical economics sees scarcity as relative, which would allow the economy to keep growing in theory. That is, nature is considered as an input to production, but as it is only one of the input factors, natural capital will simply become more expensive as it becomes scarcer, and it will be substituted for man-made capital, allowing the economy to keep on expanding. Ecological economics emphasizes that the economy is a subsystem of the bigger ecosystem, Mother Earth. These schools of thought treat scarcity as absolute and warn that continued growth is only a recipe for disaster. Before delving deeper into neoclassical economics and its insights, It makes some sense to talk a bit about its prequel, classical economics. And no brief history of economics is complete without quoting Adam Smith at least once. Smith, like other classical economists, was concerned with what determines the value of goods. In their search to what determines the value of goods, Smith introduced a distinction between use value and exchange value in a Yoda-like description. What are the rules which men naturally observe in exchanging them either for money or for one another? I shall now proceed to examine. These rules determine what may be called the relative or exchangeable value of goods. The word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. The things which have the greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange, and on the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. According to Smith, the exchange value was determined by the amount of labor it embodies, or in his words, the value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. The first neoclassical economists differed in two important aspects from their classical predecessors. First, exchange value was no longer thought to be the embodied labor, but subjective. Beauty, or value, lies in the eye of the beholder. And second, the neoclassical economists introduced mathematics into economics, and with this the thinking in marginal changes. Probably the most famous early neoclassical economist is William Stanley Jevons, whose paradox of increasing consumption in response to efficiency gains is still important. University College London professor Mariano Mazzucato had a recent TED Talk about economic value in which she also talks about this marginal revolution. And she says the following. So the revolution here is a change from objective to subjective. But also the logic is no longer one of what is value, how is it being determined, what is the reproductive potential of the economy, which then leads to a theory of price, but rather the reverse, a theory of price and exchange which reveals value. Now that is a huge change. Neoclassical economics has come to dominate much of the economics discipline since Jevons. Let me try to become more clear on what neoclassical economics is by borrowing from Weintraub. Neoclassical economics is what is called a meta-theory. That is, it is a set of implicit rules or understandings for constructing satisfactory economic theories. Its fundamental assumptions are not open to discussion in that they define the shared understanding of those who call themselves neoclassical economists or economists without any adjective. Those fundamental assumptions include the following. People have rational preferences over outcomes. 2. Individuals maximize utility and firms maximize profits. And 3. People act independently on the basis of full and relevant information. We can see this maximizing behavior also in the definition of economics by Jeffens. The problem of economics may, as it seems to me, be stated thus. Given a certain population with various needs and powers of production, in possession of certain lands and other sources of material, required the mode of employing their labor which will maximize the utility of the produce, where we can understand utility as the subjective value. One should not confuse neoclassical economics with neoliberalism. According to neoliberalists, a society is best off when states intervene as little as possible with free markets. Neoclassical economists have shown various examples of market failures, and most neoclassical economists would argue for active government policy to address these failures. Several of these market failures also concern our interaction with the environment. More strongly, Kenneth Arrow, a more recent neoclassical economist, contends that when it concerns these interactions with the environment, the starting point of the discussion must still be the much abused neoclassical theory. The explanation of environmental problems as due to the non-existence of markets is similarly an insight of purely neoclassical origin. I focused this lecture on externalities, as I thought it possibly connects best with this idea of an old linear economy. During the course Environmental Economics, we will treat the other market failures, and there will be attention to ecological economics as well. Externalities refer to uncompensated external effects of consumption or production, or as Pigou described, costs are thrown upon people not directly concerned, through, say, uncompensated damage done to surrounding woods by sparks from railway engines. All such effects must be included. Some of them will be positive, others negative elements, in reckoning up the social net product of the marginal increment of any volume of resources turned into any use or place. In other words, a problem of externalities occurs when property rights are not assigned or impossible to assign, and the effects on affected third parties are neglected in the decision making. In case of negative externalities, as for example with many polluting activities, this leads to overconsumption and overproduction. Consequently, many neoclassical economists recognize that the non-existence of markets for air and water give rise to environmental problems. The solution offered by Pigou was to introduce taxes equal to the external effects. Such a tax would ensure that consumers or producers internalize the external effects of their consumption and production. You can think of taxes on carbon, gasoline, or tobacco. The other solution offered by neoclassical economist Ronald Coase was one of cap and trade. By assigning property rights, the affected parties would arrive at the social optimum through bargaining and trade. The European Union's emission trading scheme is an example of such cap and trade application. Naturally, much of the distributional consequences depend on whether these emission rights are assigned based on historical emissions or auctioned. Both solutions also have some drawbacks. Again, a theme we return to in a few weeks. But to name a few already, some argue that taxes, or in other cases fines, are in a sense prices, and that such monetary incentives may erode intrinsic motivation to do the correct thing. Similarly, the solution of introducing a market mechanism to deal with environmental challenges may not be innocent either. The much criticized Homo economicus, who is selfish and rational, seems like a natural point of departure for anonymous market interactions. Naturally, the market does not turn everyone into calculating egoists, yet there is evidence that market interactions make us act more selfish. A finding that is paradoxically enough in contradiction with the typical neoclassical assumption that people have preferences over outcomes, but that preferences would be stable over different procedures or forms of interaction. In one of the most famous recent economic experiments, Falk and Sheh investigated the willingness to pay to save a mouse from execution. Participants could choose between earning money from the experiment or spending it to prevent the execution of a lab mouse. The participants were informed that it concerned lab mice that were bred for a medical experiment but lacked the genetic attributes of interest for that study. The introduction included descriptions and videos of how the mice were executed and explained that saving the mouse means that it would spend the remaining 2 years of its life in a protected environment with other mice. In the individual control group, participants had the choice between earning 10 euros from the experiment or nothing but saving the mouse. In the bilateral market treatment, participants faced a double-sided auction where a seller and a buyer negotiated over an agreement of how to split 20 euros for killing the mouse. The multilateral market treatment resembled this setup. Here there were 7 buyers and 9 sellers negotiating over the 20 euro split. In both market treatments, the sellers and buyers could make multiple offers. The percentage of saved mice was significantly lower in the market interaction treatments. In the individual control group, half the participants was willing to have a mouse killed and earn 10 euros from the experiment, whereas in the market treatments, 75% of the participants was willing to do so for 10 euros or less. According to Falk and Sheh, the literature gives several possible explanations for this. First, in the market interaction, the responsibility is shared. Second, offers in the market interactions suggest some level of social acceptability. Third, the market framing could speak more strongly towards materialistic desires or competitive tendencies. The authors had expected a difference between the two market treatments due to the replacement logic being a stronger force in the multilateral market. That is, if I don't buy the killing of this mouse for such a great deal, then I'm sure someone else will. Yet this difference did not occur. The notion of externalities is closely related to the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons refers to a theory that open access resources will become depleted due to lack of property rights. The idea here is that individual fishermen does not take stock depletion effects into account and thereby has a negative externality on other fishermen. By neglecting the effect on stock depletion and others, it can still be individually rational to keep on fishing when the socially optimal caught has already been surpassed. We can recognize this tragedy of the commons when examining fisheries. Myers and Worm show rapidly declining fish stocks in nearly every region where industrial fisheries were introduced. In most seas, the populations of big hunters such as shark or tuna are reduced to less than 10% of their pre-industrial numbers. Myers and Worm also warn for the phenomenon of shifting baselines. That is, that one should be careful of basing catch quota for sustainable fishing on current population levels. Here we can see a similar picture of a decline of global natural resources that are often open access, in this case, forests. with a figure comparing an estimate from the global forest cover before industrialization with 2006 from estimates by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. The tragedy of the commons was named such by Garrett Hardin. He argued that the commons were bound for tragedy because any individual resource-saving behavior would simply mean that it would be consumed by someone else. He argued that rational users will draw from the commons until the marginal benefits from doing so no longer outweigh the marginal cost, but that in determining this level, users neglect the external effects of stock depletion. On a global level, there seems to be much evidence in line with the tragedy, as we can see from several open access resources being rapidly depleted. Yet, the tragedy is not without critiques. One such critique comes from the new institutional economic school of thought. Elinor Ostrom and colleagues criticize the inevitability of the tragedy and its generality, and point out that Hardin's proposed solution was either socialism or the privatism of free enterprise. The starkness of Hardin's original statement has been used by many scholars and policymakers to rationalize central government control of all common pool resources and to paint a disempowering, pessimistic vision of the human prospect. According to Ostrom and colleagues, Hardin's neglect of traditional forms of group property or collective ownership is harmful, as these forms of governance are often most effective. In their review, Ostrom and colleagues refer to the work of Snead, who used satellite images from the Asian steppe to illustrate that Mongolian local group property led to less erosion and degradation as compared to state-owned lands in Russia, as well as compared to China, where the land was first state-owned and later turned private. The study by Snead does not mean that environmental policy is doomed to fail, nor that group property schemes are always effective in safeguarding sustainability. Yet, most remaining biodiversity, 80% according to some estimates, is on lands that are owned, occupied, or used by indigenous communities around the globe. Most of these communities have close ties with nature and have coexisted with healthy ecosystems at times already for centuries. A recent study by Burgess, Costa and Alken used satellite images to study deforestation in the Amazon and the effects of Brazilian policy. The study compares deforestation at both sides of the border with Brazil and illustrates both the power of environmental policy and its fragility. On this slide, we see the results from Burgess and colleagues. We see deforestation on the y-axis, and the x-axis gives the distance to the Brazilian border, where positive values refer to the Brazilian side and negative values to its different neighbors. In the top row of figures, we see that the deforestation rate was higher in Brazil at the start of the century. From about 2006-2007, the deforestation rate of Brazil starts to drop and becomes nearly equal to its neighbors. The authors attribute this change to a stricter environmental policy under the Green Party of Lula da Silva. I will also add a summary by Fox with a V to the references. Unfortunately, in the bottom row, we see that deforestation in the Amazon starts to pick up again from about 2016, coinciding with a dismantling of environmental protection under Bolsonaro. Here we see an overview of policy instruments organized from mildly paternalistic awareness campaigns to command and control type of bans and legal liability. We speak of nudges when one tries to influence behavior by changes to the choice structure without changing the incentives. This policy instrument is largely based on the work of behavioral economists and psychologists. In between, we see policies that introduce incentives or prices in the form of taxes or cap and trade. Determining the optimal policy mix will depend on the situation. One such factor is the type of pollution and whether it is a flow or stock type of pollutant. We speak of flow pollutants in case the damage persists only for a short time, and stock pollutants for pollutants that have longer atmospheric lifetimes. In case of the latter, a Pigouvian tax should be set equal to the discounted cumulative marginal external damage. Determining these external costs is challenging and a theme on which we come back in environmental economics, discussing the estimates of social cost of carbon. This distinction between flows and stocks is also relevant to the courses of degrowth, and I imagine later in this course when looking at Sankey diagrams. And this distinction between flows and stocks also illustrates one of the problems with the obsession of increasing GDP, or gross domestic product. GDP is a flow measure of the monetary value of transactions in the take, make and waste economy. It does not subtract damage on third parties due to external effects, nor does it take stock depletion into account. The drawbacks of the GDP measure were probably most famously worded by Robert Kennedy in saying that it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Economic growth does not give happiness, as we see illustrated here with a graph from Victor's Managing Without Growth. Slower by design, not disaster. The global desire to pursue economic growth is becoming increasingly dangerous in the age of mankind. Crutzen proposed the term Anthropocene to describe a new geological epoch, where humanity has come to dominate most important natural cycles. For example, Crutzen described that more than half of all accessible water is now used by humans. Clay and Gradel give an estimate for which elements humanity dominates natural flows. A special working group from the Geological Society led by Waters and colleagues was also favorable to adopting the term Anthropocene based on their reviews of modifications to landscapes and ocean floors with mining and trawler fishing, combined with the massive introduction of new materials such as concrete and plastic. This notion of the Anthropocene had inspired Rockström and colleagues to formulate planetary boundaries for human activities. The authors explain that surpassing these boundaries leads to unacceptable risks on disastrous environmental change. Rockström and colleagues formulated 9 such planetary boundaries and suggest parameter values for the threshold of 7 of these. The authors conclude that human activities have exceeded the safe threshold on 3 of these boundaries already, being climate change, biodiversity loss, and disturbances to the nitrogen and phosphate cycles. The framework has more recently also been extended to include a zone of uncertainty. And this year, Netflix has published a documentary film entitled Breaking Boundaries, featuring Johan Rockström and David Attenborough. Economic growth hardly seems like an appropriate solution to the environmental and social challenges that humanity is facing. So, how come that many economists believe that further growth can help the environment? First, as mentioned, neoclassical economics sees scarcity as relative and expect economies to substitute natural resources for man-made capital as natural resources become scarcer. Moreover, their scarcity will increase incentives for conservation, and as countries become richer, the demand for environmental quality, which is often seen as a luxury good, will increase. So some argue we need economic growth to save the environment. This idea was popularized in the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis. Unfortunately, this hypothesis is rooted more in wishful thinking than empirical reality. Hickel and Collis review that there is no evidence of absolute decoupling of environmental impacts and economic growth. There is some evidence of relative decoupling, meaning that the economy is growing faster than the impacts, but no evidence of economic growth being accompanied by decreasing environmental impact on a global level. Due to its negligence of absolute scarcity, neoclassical economics is unable to give an answer to the question, what is the optimal size of the economy? The neoclassical answer is only bigger. Yet the question seems to have become increasingly relevant in our time of ecological overshoot. And to most non-economists, smaller seems like a more sensible answer. In this overview of shortcomings of neoclassical economics, I wanted to highlight a critique by one of its finest members, Kenneth Arrow. Arrow describes two main challenges to neoclassical economics. First, that it is extremely difficult to model the ignorance of economic agents. There have been many advances in making the Homo economicus used in models more human by including other regarding preferences or biases, yet modeling irrational behavior that is also descriptive or predictive of something is more difficult. As a second challenge to neoclassical economics, Arrow describes that most models are silent on how markets reach their equilibria. In describing the merits of market capitalism, Arrow describes, we tend to regard it as a virtue of the system that the individual agent need not know very much. Indeed, the apparent modesty of the information needed is one of the most appealing aspects of the neoclassical model, both in the descriptive sense that the individual decisions problem appear manageable for him and for the economist studying him, and in the normative sense that the system permits its members to spend their time and effort at producing goods rather than in unnecessary duplication of information. To illustrate this virtue of markets, it was often compared to communist central planning Russia, where supermarkets would have oversupply of some goods and shortages in others. Yet, I wonder whether this modesty of information needed is still as attractive in contemporary society, where much of the negative impacts are miles away from the place of purchase. A recent study by Babette Porcelain together with Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research estimated that for the average Dutch household, about 80% of the environmental impacts of purchases are beyond the Dutch borders. Most people have no clue how many carbon emissions are embodied in the products they buy, or how to save on these emissions by buying alternatives. So, what alternatives do we have? What are post-growth perspectives? I would argue that post-growth perspectives are those that consider economic growth as an undesirable policy objective. Amongst these perspectives, one might distinguish the following flavors. A growth that argues for policy objectives other than economic growth and is agnostic towards economic growth. Possibly the most famous current example would be Raworth's donut economics. I guess circular economy would also fit best under this header of an A growth concept. Next, there is degrowth that argues for a reduction in economic activity to return within ecological limits and to provide social justice for all. Steady state economics that argues for zero growth once within ecological boundaries. And system dynamics that studies circumstances that keep economies from spiraling. Unfortunately, post-growth perspectives and scenarios are currently missing from international conservation policy and climate policy documents. See Otero et al. And Hickel et al. For calls to include such post-growth scenarios. In summary, in this lecture I have argued that neoclassical economics has yielded insights that are important to the conservation of nature. The neoclassical school of economics does so based on a few simplifying assumptions that allow modelers flexibility and give mathematical rigor. Yet, these models also give the illusion of precision and scientific legitimacy. Many environmental policies are inspired by neoclassical insights, with perhaps the cap and trade markets serving as the most prominent example. After this brief review of externalities and the tragedy of the commons, I gave attention to some of its shortcomings. Most notably, neoclassical economics neglects absolute scarcity, and its consequential growth imperative is becoming increasingly dangerous in the Anthropocene. Finally, I have argued that we can find inspiration for more sustainable policies in post-growth school of thought. This is what I have prepared for today. The references are split over 2 slides. You can pause the video if you want to inspect all. And thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments during the discussion in class. Or if you see this at a later point in time, you can drop me a line.